I don't know when it was that I first heard the story of Icarus. Maybe you've heard this one too. It's an ancient Greek story about a young man and his father who are imprisoned by a king. And they're trying to escape, and the way they decide to escape is the father, being quite an inventor, figures out how to use wax and feathers to create wings. And see, some of you are smiling like you've heard this story before, right? And they begin to use these wings. They strap them to their arms and begin to fly. And that's how they're going to escape. And before they fly, the father looks at Icarus and he says, look, don't fly too close to the sun, because the sun could melt your wings. And they begin to fly, like you do in your dreams. They begin to fly, and as they're flying and flapping their wings, they begin to fly and to escape. And Icarus is so excited, and he begins to fly higher and higher and higher, and he forgets his father's warning, and he flies too close to the sun. And the wax holding the feathers in begins to melt, and Icarus plunges into the water below and perishes. Which is about the dumbest story I've ever heard in my life. I mean, come on. Seriously? How many of you actually think that if you had a really cool pair of wings strapped to your arms, you could actually generate the lift needed to get you off the ground? Here's the deal. I don't know how much force it would take to get me off the ground. I know what the bathroom scale doesn't like to tell me. And I know that that'd be quite an amount of force, and I know approximately how much force like this I have, and they just don't match. I'm not getting myself off the ground, right? And beyond that, when you think a little more deep about this, we know what happens as you go up, right? I mean, you ever been on top of a mountain? You ever been to Pikes Peak or, I don't know if we have any Everest climbers up here, but have you ever noticed the top of the mountains, Everest always has snow on it? Why? Because the higher you get, the colder it gets. There's no point. You would have to fly outside of our atmosphere and fly to the sun to actually get hot enough, right? So it's not happening, right? And this is one of those really weird stories. When you start thinking deeply about it, there's no point of it that actually holds up. It's kind of the tortoise and the hare. I mean, have you ever thought about how ridiculous that story is? Okay, yeah, I get it. Slow and steady wins the race. But I promise you, if you put anyone out there who's actually run track in high school and have me race them in a mile race, I promise you, it doesn't matter how steady I am. They're winning. It's not even close, right? I mean, and beyond that, you just have to get past the animals talking to each other, because that's what they do. Tortoises and hares. I mean, some of these stories, right, are when you actually start thinking about it, you go, this is kind of ridiculous, right? There's no part of the story that really holds up. And yet, we use these as teaching tools all the time. Don't we? I mean, some of you are looking at me really grumpy right now because you're well, that's not the point. The point is not that it's accurate. The point is that we're trying to teach a lesson. I know. I get it. I'm a parent. I understand this thing. I'm using this all the time, right? But some of you are looking at me you're really grumpy that I'm poking a hole in your favorite teaching tool. Really? I mean, I get it, right? I mean, here's the thing. We tell these stories all the time, and we tell stories to teach a lesson. And sometimes the story that we tell doesn't really hold up. And we know it. And we're okay with it. Right? Because we're trying to teach a lesson. Don't fly too high. Don't get too full of yourself because your wings might melt. Right? We go, okay. We understand the point of the story, and so we are willing to forget about some of the more crazy parts of it that don't hold up. Right? Now, can I tell you, Jesus did the exact same thing? We are not that revolutionary with our storytelling. Jesus does the exact same thing. This morning, we're going to look at a passage of Scripture, at a story that part of us sits there and we listen to it and we go, oh, that makes me really uncomfortable. And I think Jesus goes, yeah, it's okay. It's fine. There's parts of the story that make us uncomfortable. That's okay. Jesus is going to say, look, instead of focusing on the parts of the story that make you uncomfortable, instead of trying to make it all make sense and push it all into a reality that we like, instead of doing that, focus on the point of the story. I mean, the same thing happened last week. We talked about the prodigal son, right? There's parts of that story that are they're uncomfortable. Right? This week, we're in the next part of the story with Luke chapter 16, and we're going to look at another uncomfortable story. So Luke chapter 16, I want to invite you to open your Bibles there. We're going to start with verse 1. If you have that flat screen, if you have that phone, you're welcome to open it up and take a look there. The Bible app, or it's going to be here on the screen behind me, or if you have that paper Bible, feel free. In fact, one of the things I love about having my paper Bible is you can write in the thing. Did you know that? You're allowed. Jesus said it's okay. Don't worry, ask him. And so you can mark that thing up, and sometimes it's helpful to mark things up in the Bible. So Luke chapter 16, verse 1, we're going to start reading there. Jesus told his disciples, here's the story. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in, and he asked, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot manage here any longer. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And the manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. Well, take your bill and make it 800. And the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now, we're going to pause there for a minute. Let's just talk about it and acknowledge some stuff in this story. There's a lot of this that we don't like. There's a lot of parts of this story. You have a man, a very rich man, who has a great deal of wealth, and he has hired someone to manage it for him. And so he starts hearing rumors that this manager is not the best manager and that he's being dishonest. And so he calls him in. But instead of giving him a chance to defend himself, he doesn't do that. I mean, that would be our first thing, right? If your boss called you in and just said, I've heard rumors about you, you're going to get fired, we would look at the TV and call the first lawyer we could who promised to help us, right? This doesn't match our society. Like, there's no part where the owner, where the master gives a chance for defense. There's no point where he actually looks and says, okay, are you being dishonest or aren't you? Are these rumors true or aren't they? He doesn't do any of that. He just looks at him and goes, okay, you're going to get fired. And then he says, I'm going to fire you. Now, go get the books and bring him in. Which, as a owner, as a master, you're like, that's kind of dumb, right? Like, what you do is you have someone bring the books in and then you fire them. That way they can't take any trade secrets with you, right? But they don't do it. He goes, okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to fire you. Go get all the stuff, get all the books and bring it in, which is really weird. And then what happens is this guy, this manager, he has like a few minutes to think. And so the first thing he does, he starts making phone calls. He starts calling people. He says, get in here. How much do you owe? And I owe 800 gallons of olive oil. Well, cut it in half. Which we completely understand, like, this manager, he's dishonest. So he starts like just completely taking money out of his master's pocket. Which again, in our society we go, lawsuit. But not here. Here, the owner, the master goes, dude, you're brilliant. Which is not the response we'd want, right? We'd expect them to punch him in the face, to get him arrested. We'd expect for him to be like, look, I'm going to lock you up until you pay all that back. You're going to squish that extra 400 gallons of olive oil out with your own two hands. You're going to figure out how to pay me back. But that's not what happens, right? This is one of those stories that's really odd. And then he says this. He says, the master commended, verse 8, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Another translation of this word is the word wisely. It's actually translated wisely in some other passages in Scripture. The master looks at the guy he just fired and goes, man, you're really wise. You're still fired, but you're really wise. Got to be honest with you, I never actually, when I grew up in church and we were in children's church and we were coloring pictures and stuff like that, we never talked about this one. I'm kind of glad that my daughters haven't learned this one yet. In fact, I'm hoping one of them's not listening this morning. Right? Because here's the thing, right? Like, there's a part where you sit there and go like, what's going on? Like, I would never, like, if one of my girls just decided to like steal my credit card and just like start ringing up charges, like, I wouldn't be like, great job. You know, like if one of my daughters decided to steal my credit card, go down to Walmart, buy like 1,500 candy bars, and be like, I'm taking these to school so I can give them to people and they'll be my friends. I'm not going to say, great job, kiddo, you're awesome. I mean, what were you thinking? And beyond that, like, how are we going to get that money back? You're going to pay that one back. That part of the credit card bill you're paying, but I wanted to make friends. Try being nice. Like, I'm not going to like pay you. I'm not okay with you taking my money to buy candy bars to make friends. But that's exactly what happens here, isn't it? There's this part of the story where this person who is not somebody that we're supposed to emulate. We are not supposed to be like the dishonest manager. That part, like, that's not the person that we're supposed to model our lives after. But in this story, it's the dishonest manager who is held up as wise. And everyone goes, that was pretty smart. Why? It doesn't make sense. When we try to bring the story and push it in to our lives as this fits. It's like the Icarus story. It's like the tortoise and the hare. It's not all supposed to make sense. Rather, we're supposed to look at the point of the story and say, what is the point? What is Jesus pushing at? What is Jesus pushing us toward to get us to understand? And thankfully, Jesus tells us. Jesus says this. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus is trying to help us understand something. That each and every one of us in our lives are given resources. Now, oftentimes, and especially in this passage, Jesus is going to talk about money, but this applies to all kinds of things in our lives. We all have a lot of resources, whether it be financial resources, whether it be resources of time. We're all given time and we get to choose how to spend our time. We're all given different gifts and abilities. Some of us are given athletic gifts. Some of us are given the gift of being able to talk in front of people. Or some of us have this innate ability to influence and to guide and to lead. Some of us are gifted as artists. Like, we're given all these gifts. We have these resources that we've been given. And what Jesus wants us to understand is that what is important and what should guide our resources is our intention with them. In other words, you all have resources and you all have reasons why you do what you do. And your reasons will always guide how you use your resources. Look at this dishonest manager for a second. At first, at the beginning of the story, his job is to use the resources, his ability to manage the resources of the master to help the master make money. And so his reason, at the very beginning of the story, his reason is supposed to be to serve the master and to enrich the master. But then he finds out that he's going to get fired, at which point his reasons, his push, his focus, his desire completely changes. He says, wait a second, now I'm in trouble. And his reasoning, his focus, it moves from enriching the master and caring for the master's property to how am I going to take care of myself? Do you see this? His focus, his reasoning moves. And he goes from focusing on the master stuff to focusing on how do I care for, how do I make sure that I am going to be okay. He's like, look, I can't go out, I can't dig, I can't do physical labor. And quite frankly, I don't want to go out and beg. And pretty soon, I'm going to be in a position where I need help. What do I do? And what he does is he says, okay, I have for a little bit, I have some resources. I have the ability to control this person's wealth, and I'm going to use it for my purposes. This makes sense. And because the purposes change, because the reasoning changes, because his focus changes, because his end goal changes, it affects how he uses the resources that he has. And Jesus says, this is the point. Your reasoning, your purpose, your focus, whatever word you want to use, your goal, whatever your purpose, your reasoning is, it affects how you use the resources that you have. Now, somewhere innately, we all know this. And what Jesus pushes us on here is he goes, look, people in the world, they get this. And frankly, he goes, you kind of get this too. You Christians, we just don't follow through in this very way. He says, look, people of the world, they know what their focus is. I mean, how many people do you know who would not claim to be Christian, wouldn't claim to be following Jesus, and you go like, what's your goal in life? And they go, man, I want to retire at 50. Or I want to make sure that I get that big bass boat. Or I want to make sure that when I retire, I can go and I can travel, I can this and this. And they have very clear, like, this is the why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right? We know these people. Right? And what they do in life, they are like using the resources that they have to accomplish that goal. And here's Jesus' point. As Christians, if we really believe in an eternity with Christ, why in the world are we focused on 50 years from now? Now, hear me. I'm not saying don't have a 401k. That's not what I don't think that's what Jesus is saying either. But what Jesus is saying is that we have to understand and have a very clear understanding of what our goal in life is and what the point of life is. And we have to allow that to govern and to impact and to influence how we use the resources that we've been given. Verse 10. It says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And the Pharisees who loved money heard all this, and they were sneering at Jesus, and he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men. But God knows your hearts. And what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. We just take a deep breath for a second. We're okay. It's fine. We're fine. Okay? Because this is where some of us are going to sit back and go, well, the man church all we talk about is money. That's all we talk about. Well, first of all, stop it. Just stop. Because we don't. But it is important for us to understand what Jesus' view of money and of all the resources that we have is. So the truth is, Jesus doesn't have a problem with us having money as long as you have it and it doesn't have you. The problem is for a lot of us, it's really, really, really easy to allow the resources that we've been given to become our reason. Did you know that? For a lot of us, it's really easy to allow the resources that we've been given to become our reason for doing things. And money or time or talents or treasure or anything like that becomes a really, really, really stinky reason to live. Did you know that? It really does. And the truth is that when we allow that to happen, we just start spinning our wheels all the time. Jesus' point here, when he's talking in verse 10, let's just walk through this. He says, look, some of us believe that, well, when Jesus gives me more, then I'll be faithful. When Jesus gives me more money, when Jesus gives me more influence, when Jesus gives me more of a platform, when Jesus gives me more talent, then I'll honor God with it. But right now, I just don't have enough. And Jesus says, no, you don't get it. If you aren't faithful with what you've been given now, you will not be faithful if I give you more. This is the problem. And to pull it out of money, because money is like a touchy subject for us, right? Let's just take it out of money for a second. Every once in a while, I will meet a pastor, I'll meet a leader who goes, you know something? As soon as I get a bigger church, then I'll really... No, you won't. If you won't lead with integrity when you have 10 people following you, you will not lead with integrity when you have 100 people or 1,000 people following you. Well, if I just get a bigger platform, then I'd use my talent for Jesus, right? Because we know what our talents are, right? Some of us know, like, God's given us a talent for singing or for speaking or whatever. Well, right now, if Michelle would just let me sing all the solos, then I would volunteer. But doggone it, unless I can sing all the solos, I won't volunteer. My friends, if you will not use the talents you have, for God with no solos, I promise you, God will not be the focus if you have all the solos. Just how it works. Well, you know something? If people would just focus on me, people just follow me, then I would give more time. I would do. If you will not honor God with what God has given you now, I promise you, it will not matter what God gives you. God cannot give you enough of anything to honor God if you won't honor God right where you're at. See, I think for some of us, what's happening is we are waiting for God to give us what we want. We are waiting for God to check our boxes. Then, no, it doesn't work that way, my friends. Jesus says this, honor God where you are. If you will honor God with what God's given you now, with your time, with your talents, with your treasure, with everything God's given you, if you honor God, if we're willing to honor God where we are right now, then God will trust us to honor him when we're given more. Jesus says this, look, The problem with allowing your resources to drive the ship is that you can only have one master. There can only be one pilot. What should happen, and we all know this, what should happen is the pilot should always be God. That's what should happen. But it's really, really, really easy for us to nudge God out of the way and say, I'm going to drive the ship. Years ago, there was I think it's been long enough ago, the statute of limitations has passed. I hope so. Years ago, when I was growing up, there was a church down the road from us, and everyone in town kind of knew that there was a difficulty between the pastor and the parishioners there. And a group of the parishioners, it was known in town. A group of the parishioners decided, here's what we're going to do. We've decided that we're going to stop tithing, and instead what we're going to do is we're going to take the money that we would have tithed, and we're going to take it to the bank, and we're going to put it on the mortgage. And there's a part of that that goes, ooh, that's one way to get your opinion across. And now, years and years later, I go, oh. You know what didn't happen? God didn't honor it. They didn't get their way. As soon as we take God out of the picture and we start using our own, we start trying to use our resources to manipulate and to advance our purposes, God says, I'm not in control of that anymore. You can have one master. One master. This passage, sure, Jesus talks about money a lot, but it's not just about money. It's about a deeper principle of who is actually driving the ship and what matters most to you. It's a deeper principle of your resources being used to further God's kingdom, or are you trying to push your own? There's a song that we're going to sing in closing today, and it's a song, I came across it years ago, and I love the words in it. And the words are kind of like they're a little promise, a little opportunity to just simply reflect and say, God, this is where my heart is. But what I want to do this morning is I don't want to invite you to sing just because we're singing. Rather, I want to invite you to sing if you mean it. The words simply say this: you can have it all. God, you can have every part of my life. For some of us, we already know which part we don't want to give up, don't we? We don't want to give up our bank account or our calendar. We don't want to give up our dreams of kicking Brian out of here and taking over his spot. We don't want to give that up, right? We don't want to give up. We don't want to give up on certain dreams we have. But what Jesus says is this: you can have one master. There can be one Lord. There can be one person driving the ship.